John Landry with the USS Midway Museum in San Diego presented the museum's lecture, Battle of the Coral Sea. John explains the background, goals, and strategies for both the U.S. and Japan. He details the minute-by-minute events of the battle between May 4th to May 8th, which was the first naval battle between aircraft carriers where all battle damage was done only by aircraft without either battle groups seeing the other. The battle stopped Japan's advance in the Pacific and was critical for the U.S. victory at Midway just 1 month later.
Well, good morning and welcome, everyone. Glad you could join us this morning. I am Barbara Rogers, stepping in for our president, who is here, but really not here. We can't hear him. So again, welcome. Okay, at this time, it's my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Mr. John Landry. He is a docent at the USS Midway Aircraft Carrier Museum in San Diego. And his topic today is the Battle of the Coral Sea, Battle of the Titans. Anxious to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much. As Barbara has said, I'm docent on the Midway, also a Navy veteran. And for you architects and engineers, I'm also an architect. Had my own practice here in Carlsbad, California, and retired in 2005. What you see on the screen is the actual USS Midway Museum tied up to Navy Pier in San Diego. And you can see the carrier tied up here near the downtown area, Navy Pier. The ship was named after the Battle of Midway. Because I served on guided missile destroyers in the U.S. Navy, you may think the carrier is the center of attention of this picture, but if you look past the carrier, you'll see the most important part, which is a plane guard destroyer, something I'm very familiar with. The Midway is the longest serving carrier in the U.S. Navy, 47 years. Midway was also the flagship for Operation Desert Storm. This is a picture of one of our F-4 Phantoms on the flight deck. Our squadron commander has a motto, which is, our Phantoms don't say boo. Well, here we are. Welcome to the Battle of Coral Sea, a very important battle in the first 7 months of the war in the Pacific. This presentation will be featuring our U.S. Navy carrier pilots. This is one of a series of lectures that the Midway gives. Of course, the first one's Pearl Harbor, then the Doolittle Raid this afternoon, the Battle of Coral Sea. All of these battles are interconnected with one another and dependent on the outcome of each one of these events in the Pacific War. Battle of Coral Sea raged between May 4 and May 8, 1942. What you see on the screen right now are the strategic commanders. Everybody's probably familiar with Admiral Yamamoto, stationed in Tokyo. And then on the far right corner is Admiral King, who was the leader of the U.S. Navy and the boss of Admiral Nimitz, who resided in Pearl Harbor. And then Admiral Inoue was the admiral in charge of the attack on Port Moresby, right next to the Coral Sea. And then at the bottom, we have General MacArthur, who is residing in Brisbane, Australia, waiting for orders to continue with the Army's portion of the war. The Japanese planned to attack Port Moresby in a secret attack. This becomes very important. And actually a characteristic of the Japanese. They're very, very dependent on secrecies, which is what they did with the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Coral Sea is adjacent, as you can see here, to Australia and New Guinea. Operation MO, as the Japanese called it, was the attack on Port Moresby, and we'll get into their strategy a little bit later in the presentation. The Japanese had 3 targets before they would take on Port Moresby, and that would be Rabaul, Leh, and Salamula, and Tulagi, to tighten their grip on the Coral Sea and be able to attack anyone who was going to attack them. Japan's strategic goal was to rule all of East Asia without interference from America. And that is one of the main reasons why they proceeded to attack us at Pearl Harbor, seeking to put us out of commission for a certain period of time, 6 months minimum. The Japan had spectacular success in expanding their empire, as you can see from the red dots here, from South Korea, Manchuria, China, Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, and their next target was Port Moresby. This engenders the Japanese with what we call the victory disease and lures Japan into believing they can do things that maybe they can't, and that they also have the manifest destiny to rule all of East Asia. So the Japanese plans, as I said, it was to hit Pearl Harbor on a secret attack and keep us out of their backyard while they proceeded to overtake all of East Asia and Micronesia as well. So the subject of today's presentation is the capture of Port Moresby, was an extension of what they've already started with the Philippines and Indonesia. All of the yellow dots on this screen indicate friendly bases or areas of operation for the U.S. They plan to take the Central Pacific by attacking and capturing Midway. And ultimately, down the road, they wanted to capture Hawaii and present this cordon of defense and protection of their island nation. And then eventually they wanted to go into Micronesia and reap the resource benefits of that area, which would be phosphorus for ammunition, explosive and fertilizer, potash as well. And then they needed to keep the oil flowing from Malaysia and Indonesia back to Tokyo so they could prosecute their war of conquering all of East Asia. Finally, the Japanese wanted to cut off our supply to Australia, which was keeping Australia afloat. As you can see in this presentation, they fully intended to extend their homeland defense out into the Central Pacific. The strategic plan for the U.S. and its allies was pretty simple. Maintain that supply line to Australia, stop Japan's advance in the Coral Sea, and then allow General MacArthur to work his way north and island hop until we reach the homeland of Japan. The Battle of Coral Sea commences on 4 May. These are the commanders. On the left is Admiral Takagi, who's in charge of the entire task force for the Japanese, and the tactical commander is Admiral Hara on the aircraft carriers. And on our side, Admiral Fletcher, overall commander. Admiral Fitch is our tactical commander of Task Force 17. As you can see, Coral Sea is to the southeast of New Guinea and Port Moresby. And this is where, in an area of about 150 miles square, we will ultimately see the Battle of Coral Sea, 500 miles southeast of Port Moresby and approximately 300 miles southwest of Tulagi. The Coral Sea was the first naval battle between aircraft carriers. During the 1930s, we see the ascendancy of aircraft carriers as the capital ships of the Navy and the descendancy of battleships. So this turns out to be the first battle between aircraft carriers. It is a time when there's a tactical learning curve for the carrier commanders. This is Task Force 17. This happens to be the USS Lexington, CV-2, the second aircraft carrier in the U.S. Navy. This is the Yorktown, CV-5, the fifth carrier. And then for the Japanese, they have their two newest carriers, the Zuikaku and the Shokaku, both commissioned in December of 1941. And then the Shoho is a light carrier meant to support the invading army of Port Moresby. And this is the first naval battle where all damage is inflicted by carrier aircraft, and you will see that as we progress in the presentation. This is our SPD Dauntless dive bomber, which was able to inflict major damage on the Japanese fleet. This is the Japanese Zero, which was clearly the superior aircraft at that time in the Pacific War. This is also the first time combatants have not had a visual contact with one another. If you're a battleship Navy, you can pretty much predict where your enemy is going to be, some 20 miles. With the carrier, we've got 300 miles of distance that we can conduct a battle with carrier aircraft. And also, this battle is conducted in the vastness of the Coral Sea. This brings up the issue of locating the enemy, which happens to be a very, very important premise for aircraft carrier warfare. It's a challenge because you want to be the first one to locate the enemy. You want to deliver the first attack. And usually when that happens, you are going to destroy the enemy carrier force. So you'll see that play out in this presentation. Well, here we are in the Coral Sea, some 1,100 miles in diameter, the distance between the Mexican border and the Canadian border in the US. It's a massive area equal to all of California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, half of Colorado and half of New Mexico. And we're dealing with ships that will travel at about 20 knots. These are the aircraft that can be used in trying to locate the enemy. The one on the right, the flying boat for the Japanese, was very effective for the Japanese. There were also short-range scouts that could be launched from the aircraft carriers to identify the location of the enemy. Uniquely, we had the early versions of radar where the Japanese did not, and you will see in this presentation there was a very critical use of radar at one point in the Battle of Coral Sea that effectively knocked out one of the Japanese carriers. Well, in 1941, the world was at war. 1937, Japan invades Shanghai. 1939, the Germans invaded Poland. And of course, in 1941, Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So as you can see from this illustration, America was clearly in a two-ocean war. For those who don't remember, right off the East Coast, the Germans killed more people than were killed at the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. There were approximately 5,000 casualties of the U-boats sinking cargo ships right off our coast. And of course, we know the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. This happens to be the USS Arizona during the attack. What I would consider to be a true statement, but and I don't know if it's actual, but it is one that we believe that Yamamoto felt once the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and he initially was totally against attacking Pearl Harbor. So in 42, the United States had a significant peril with a two-ocean war. So here we go, and we're going to talk about the Battle of Coral Sea from May 4th to May 8th, the Battle of the Titans. This is the USS Yorktown, which was commissioned in September of 1937. This is the Lexington, and it was commissioned in 1927. This is the newest carrier in the Japanese fleet, Shokaku. Its sister ship, commissioned in 1941, the Zuikaku, the newest and most powerful carriers that were plying the oceans of the world at that time. This is the light carrier Shoho, used primarily to support the invading army that would have invaded Port Moresby. Now, this happens to be critical. Our intel was superior. We had an intel station on Pearl Harbor called Operation Hypo, and this is a picture of Commander Rochefort, who was in charge with his senior officer Layton, both very superior intel officers. They were holed up in the administration building in the basement. They were connected with Australia headquarters in Washington and intel, the Corregidor, as long as we were there in the Philippines before we got attacked by the Japanese. So as I said, the Japanese plan was based on a secret attack, but in April 42, Operation Hypo breaks the Japanese naval and diplomatic code JN-25. Japanese were unaware of this, and our American commanders had intel on the size and composition of the Japanese forces, details of their operation plan, periodic location of their carrier force, the location of their invasion force, and in general, their ship movements. Admiral Nimitz from Pearl Harbor, who was the commanding Navy admiral of the Pacific, trusted his intel Hypo operation and used it very effectively. Now we're going to take a look at the ship movements or the battlefield plot of the Battle of Coral Sea and give you an overview, because there were a lot of ship movements between 4 of May and 8 May. This is the lineup of the commanders. Admiral Inoue, the commander of both Admiral Takagi and Admiral Hara, who is the tactical commander. And then we have Task Force 17, Admiral Fletcher, who was on the Yorktown, and Admiral Fitch, tactical commander on the Lexington. And then we had Admiral Grace from the Australian Navy, and they provided a destroyer force to help attack the Japanese if they had attacked Port Moresby. Here's everything you need to know about the Battle of Coral Sea and ship movements. And I'm sure everybody understands this at a glance. However, another way to look at this with the same data is to tease it out into 2 areas of operation, one for us and one for the Japanese. The red box is the general area the Japanese operated in, and the yellow box is the the general area of the movements of the U.S. Task Force 17. The Task Force 17 track, starting in the lower right-hand corner, they arrived in the area on May 3rd, and eventually, after all of their movements, they left the Coral Sea on the 8th of May at 1700 hours. Now, if we look at the Japanese movements, which is generally to the north of where Admiral Fletcher operated, their movements look like this. Now, if you look at the dotted circle, and I'm going to go back and look at the combined track. That circle represents the time when the 2 forces came within 70 miles of one another, and this occurred 1900 hours on the 6th of May. Neither force, knowing that they were that close in the Coral Sea and had spent a lot of time, energy, and assets to try and locate one another. So prior to the Battle of Coral Sea, the Japanese had captured Rabaul, Leh, Salamula, and Tulagi. And Tulagi was going to be a seaplane recon base, and Rabaul turns out to be an airbase, a bomber airbase for a long-range search for the enemy. You can see Rabaul, Tulagi, and Leh, Salamula proximate to the yellow dot, which is Port Moresby, which eventually becomes the main target for the Japanese invasion. From Rabaul, their aircraft could search some 600 miles out. From Tulagi, they could do the same thing with their flying boats. So that caused Admiral Fletcher to operate basically south and try and stay out of the range of the search aircraft by the Japanese. So once Leh and Salamula and Rabaul were attacked, Admiral Nimitz reacted strongly to that Japanese invasion. And so he immediately sent Task Force 17 to the Coral Sea. That consisted of 2 aircraft carriers, Lexington and the Yorktown, 8 cruisers, 14 destroyers, and 2 oilers. Lexington was one of the aircraft carriers, Yorktown being the second. Not that we have to memorize this chart, but it gives you an idea of how many ships and what type We're in Task Force 17. At the bottom, we have the Australian force with two cruisers. And the Japanese are totally unaware that Task Force 17 is now operating in the Coral Sea. So between 4 May and 6 May, there's searching for the enemy, refueling, misidentifying contacts, and searching again. And we'll see what happens during this period of time. Admiral Fletcher decides to split his force in half. A very dangerous operation. He knows the Japanese have attacked Tulagi and are wanting to set up a recon base. So he does a very risky thing, and he breaks from the Lexington and the rest of his task force and heads north. So now this is his track on 4 May at 6:30 in the morning, 300 miles north of his support troops. He doesn't realize, if you see the two red dots above Tulagi, that happens to be the Carrier Division 5 for the Japanese. The risk that Fletcher's in right now is if the Japanese knew where he was, those two carriers could take him out in a moment's notice. But nonetheless, he then proceeds to launch an attack at 6 o'clock in the morning, and one at noon, and one at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then he gets out of Dodge, fortunately. His attack has been ineffective, so he's risked his carrier group for an ineffective attack because Tulagi's operational again in 2 days. Now, Takagi knows at least one carrier is in Coral Sea. And he is now, Takagi is now intends to find and crush Task Force 17. So on 6 May, Takagi does locate Fletcher through one of his flying boats. And as you can see, the Japanese are operating to the north and Fletcher to the south with Task Force 17, its two carriers. And the flying boat has located Fletcher at 1000 hours on the 6th. So then Takagi decides to send a strike force south at 20 knots to attack Fletcher. And Fletcher has no idea that the Japanese are right now sending a task force to attack him and surprise him. However, at at 7 o'clock in the evening, Takagi decides he doesn't want to do a night attack, and he's going to attack the next morning. So he gets within 70 miles of Fletcher, turns around, heads north, and holds out at midnight until the next day, where he's going to regroup his forces and attack Fletcher. As I say, Fletcher's not aware of Takagi being that close as well. So on 7 May, we get some real combat. It turns out a Japanese scout, makes contact seeing an enemy carrier formation. And the scout actually sees our oiler and our destroyer, the Sims and the Neosho, to the south of the Japanese formation. And the Japanese, again, are operating generally to the north. Right now, Fletcher is off to the left, as you can see from the yellow track. And we have Neosho and Sims quite south, trying to stay out of the action, which is what they should be doing. However, Admiral Hera, without confirmation of the contact, launches a massive attack with 18 fighters, 36 dive bombers, 24 torpedo bombers, and they decimate both the Neosho and the Sims. The Sim sinks right away with 3 bomb hits. Neosho gets hit with 7 bomb hits and eventually does not sink, and the crew gets rescued some 2 or 3 days later. Now Fletcher has limited refueling with only one oil remaining. So he's got to be careful about the oil reserves that he has. However, the Japanese at this point still do not know the location of Fletcher.
This ends Part 1 of the Battle of Coral Sea after the first attacks by the U.S. and Japan. Part 1 detailed the background and the U.S. and Japan strategies for the Pacific War and why the Battle of Coral Sea would be a pivot point for both sides. Part 2 concludes the Battle of the Titans with the sinking of one carrier for both the U.S. and Japan. Part 2 explains how U.S. intelligence and radar gave the edge to U.S. forces, how the battle stopped the invasion of Port Moresby, and contributed to the U.S. victory at Midway the next month in June. Part 2 also includes Q&A between the EAH audience and John Landry.
Engineers and architects of Hawaii welcome your comments on this program and any of our recent programs. We encourage your direct participation in this community outreach, so please email us your comments and ideas at eahawaii@gmail.com.